Thank you, Mike. And thank you, John and Mayor Bynum, for joining us today. You know, as Mike had mentioned, it's been 100 years since one of the greatest tragedies in American history, and still so little is known about it. Mayor Bynum, starting with you, how do you begin to honor the lives that were lost 100 years ago in the Tulsa race massacre?
Well, I think one of the great challenges for us is that because there was an active cover-up around this event for decades, there's still so little known about it. To this day, we don't know how many of our fellow Tulsans, fellow Americans, died in this event. That's one of the things that my administration has been really focused on, is the search for the mass graves that were created following this event. And we have identified one mass grave and are going to be doing an exhumation this summer, hopefully, to be able to determine if those are, in fact, victims from the race massacre. And the ideal for us is that we are able to then utilize DNA to connect those remains with their descendants. And all of this, I think, is part of what we're trying to do now, which is recognize the things that should have been done 100 years ago that aren't in our power to go back in time and change, but that we can do today to do right. And so whether that is something like this, which we view as really pursuing a murder investigation, which it is, or working to encourage economic revitalization, which is also something that we're very focused on. These are all areas where I think we today can do better than those who came before us.
John, you had family in Tulsa. Your great-grandfather, J.B. Stratford, owned a business there, owned a hotel. You know, in addition to the lives lost, 10,000 people were driven from their homes and businesses. How do you relate to what had happened there, John?
Well, I relate in a couple of ways. You know, my great-grandfather was a real leader in the Tulsa community at the time, and his hotel and land was worth over roughly $2 million. So a couple things happened. Because he had been such a leader in the community after the Tulsa race massacre, people wanted to have him arrested and wanted to ultimately possibly lynch him at that time. And so he had to escape Tulsa. He was able to sneak out of town. And my grandfather used his legal skills to stop Tulsa from extraditing him back. So I think about it first and foremost that he was this economic leader and civil rights leader in the community and had to escape his hometown because he was falsely accused of helping to cause the massacre. But the second thing is, of course, that $2 million versus hotel and land, what it would be worth today would be an anchor for multi-generational wealth in our community. And all the data shows that very few African Americans have a chance to benefit from inheritance and to be able to have assets go from generation to generation. So our wealth was completely snuffed out during the horrific massacre. And the only thing that I inherited, which is very, very important, is his outspokenness and his strength of character. And I know my grandfather was the same way and my mom was the same way.
I want to come back to Black wealth in just a second, because it's been so long and so much progress been left behind. But Mayor Bynum, you had spoken about the mass graves, and I'd love to know what the response has been from your community.
You know, it's been really interesting because I first started working on this about a decade ago at this point. I'd seen a report by a local independent journalist who talked about the idea that there was a mass grave in Oaklawn Cemetery, which was the main cemetery for Tulsa in the early 20th century, where my great-great-grandparents are buried. And he said, there's a mass grave here from the race massacre. And I saw that at the time, and I thought, there's no way that's true. There's no way that I grew up in this town and drove by that cemetery every day for decades, and that there's a mass grave in there and no one ever looked to see if it really was there. And came and found out that was actually true, that a state commission had done a geophysical scan, had found an anomaly in the soil, but the city would not allow them to move forward. And I asked the mayor at the time, can we please move forward on this to to see if there really is a mass grave here, because I don't want my kids growing up in a city that has mass graves that we don't try to find, and was denied that request. And so when I became mayor, we initiated this. And I think the conventional wisdom politically was that there'd be this big pushback, that people would be mad in the community, that there would be a search for mass graves. Instead, the overwhelming response that I received from people throughout our community was, thank you. It's about time. We don't want to live in a city where we don't know if there's a mass grave here or not. The other big thing that came out of it, which was not expected, was that we found there were generations who had grown up in this community, who had passed down oral histories about what had happened in the race massacre through their families that had never been published, had never been collected. But all of a sudden, once people found that there was a way to put that information, those oral histories, to use, they came forward and we started collecting them. And that has been, I think, a tremendous resource for us and will be for future generations. All of this is part of an effort we're taking right now to try and understand this event better after it was actively covered up by the community for decades. And you don't think, in the United States of America, in your own hometown, that history can almost be erased. And yet it almost was here. And I'm really grateful for everyone that's come forward to share their stories to help us do this work.
John, I'd love you to drill in a little more here, because it's not the only riot in America that has really caused a mass destruction of wealth, as well as hurt the lives of many Black people in America. What has this meant for the progress of Black people in America and the ability to gain economic freedom?
Well, it is a pretty frightening history we've gone through. We had race riots here in Chicago. There's always the famous story of the People's Grocery Store in Tennessee. Many other situations where when we get our heads above water and start to make progress and things start to be going in our direction, often what happened in the past history is white Americans had a hard time seeing Black Americans in leadership roles, creating wealth, competing head to head, toe to toe. And what we saw with the People's Grocery Store, once it was outselling the white grocery, they took the leadership of that institution and lynched them, and of course burned down the People's Grocery Store. It was a horrific attack. So we've seen this historically in our country, and it's part of the reason we haven't been able to make a dent in the wealth gap in our country, and how our wealth gap continues to get worse and worse generation by generation. The final point I'll make is, the dean of Yale's Business School, Dean Kerwin Charles, talks about, relative to white Americans today, we are worse off than our grandparents were, which is pretty shocking to see this deterioration of economic opportunity for our community.
Both of you are from cities that have a lot of gentrification, a lot of segregation, really. John, I know you do a lot in your own city of Chicago. How do you address the issue?
Well, it's interesting, my grandfather, again, who used his legal skills to stop his father from being extradited back to Tulsa, he also he took a case to the Supreme Court, along with another lawyer, Earl Dickerson. And my grandfather, C.F. Stratford, took the Hansberry versus Lee case to the Supreme Court, which centered on restrictive covenants here in Chicago. It didn't allow African Americans to buy homes in certain communities. And we weren't able to create multi-generational wealth here in Chicago because we could only buy land in certain parts of the Chicagoland community. Of course, those are the parts that didn't go up in value. And multi-generational wealth was lost there because we couldn't buy on the North Shore. We couldn't buy in the areas, again, where real wealth could be created by owning land or owning homes. So it's something that is a real challenge. What we have to do today on the segregation part is we have to create opportunities for there to be more wealth. Because today, if we have a more wealthy African-American community, I think the segregation will be less and less as people can afford to move out and be in communities that are more attractive from a financial standpoint. And so one of the things I keep saying is our anchor institutions here in Chicago and around the country need to be committed to working with minority-owned businesses in everything we do, and insisting the majority institutions have diversity on their teams. And if we are all on message around that, we'll start to see this wealth gap increase, and that will mean our education will be better, our healthcare will be better, and to your question, we'll be able to live in all aspects of our society and all the various communities in our local cities in this country.
Before we get to the answers to how we fix this problem, Mayor Bynum, I'm really curious about how this plays out in Tulsa.
Well, I think the key, as John points out, and I completely agree with it, is the development of wealth within a community. And we believe in Tulsa that that isn't something that you can do in a year or two. It really requires a sustained commitment over a prolonged period of time. And the way that you accomplish that is by establishing institutions who have a mission of following through on wealth development in historically underserved communities. And so we're taking all of our economic development apparatus that falls under the city government in Tulsa, all of the authorities that impact economic development, and combining them into one unified new authority, the Tulsa Authority for Economic Opportunity, that has as its mission eliminating disparities that exist when it comes to economic opportunity within our city historically. And, the other big thing that we've been focused on in the time that I've been mayor is all of the recruitment work that we do, all of the economic development focus. We really have aimed it at the part of our community, we call it North Tulsa, predominantly African-American part of our city where Greenwood resides. We've focused our economic development efforts there, and we've attracted over $1 billion in private investment in the last 4 years into that part of our city. And then we've partnered with local job training nonprofits that help the folks that live in that community make sure that they have the skills to compete for the jobs that are being created in that area, so that they're not just watching buildings go up in their community, they're seeing jobs come to their community, and then they can start to build that wealth over time. I think the big hurdle for us and the challenge for us, and I would love to know John's thoughts on this, is how you foster more entrepreneurship in a community, because that's really where you build wealth.
Yeah, John, I'll let you answer that too before I hop in on where the money comes from.
I think that's an important question. I think access to capital is important, but I actually think equally important is access to customers. And so what we've been able to do here in Chicago with several anchor institutions is to really realize that they're making a real difference when it comes to wealth and economic opportunity. So for example, the University of Chicago, where I'm vice chairman of the board, in the last 11 years, they've gone from working with 0 minority-owned professional services firms to now over 95. Minority-owned law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, public relations firms, government affairs firms, advertising agencies, money managers for the endowment, including us in everything that we do. And they have a symposium once a year to celebrate this, where President Zimmer is there. We've had Governor Quinn there. We've had former Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, even Michelle Obama by video, to celebrate this unique effort to create economic opportunity on the south side of Chicago. The second program I should mention is that's gone on for quite a long time. It's been quiet. Is McDonald's has a history where they have found entrepreneurs, often business leaders in the McDonald's who worked at McDonald's or were community leaders, and introduced them to entrepreneurs that were suppliers of McDonald's, and asked them to be able to create a path for these up-and-coming entrepreneurs to take control of those majority-owned businesses. And so now, if you look at the Black Enterprise list of the top 100 companies, 5 of the top 20 companies are McDonald's suppliers. Companies that are hundreds of millions of dollars in sales, multi-generational wealth that's been created over the last 25 or so years. It's because they realized that you needed customers. And if you had McDonald's as a customer buying sausages or buying croutons or what have you, ultimately you were able to build big businesses that employed hundreds of people and created real wealth in specific communities.
So that starts to address the private sector's role. We're at a time now where, on a national scale, President Joe Biden has made this a priority: racial equity, economic equity. Mayor Bynum, have you spoken to the government at all about what kind of resources you may need, and also in a historic year to draw attention to what happened to Greenwood as well?
It is perhaps a silver lining of the awful pandemic that we've just gone through in the last year, but we've been able to utilize federal funds that have come to our community as a result of the pandemic and channel them into the greatest focus in funding in job training and development in the history of our city because of those funds that have come to our community. Beyond that, we're always seeking better ideas and guidance on how we can attract capital to develop businesses. It was about 2 years ago, we were having a meeting of the Public Oversight Committee that we established to monitor the grave search process. And in that, a pastor was talking, and he said, at the time, the people that did this, the reason they did it was to drive out Black business owners from the community. And if you look at Greenwood today, they pretty much succeeded, because the only Black property owners on Greenwood, when he was saying this, were 2 churches. And that was it. And that, when he said that, it made me so angry, not at him, but at the thought that people who had perpetrated the worst event in the history of our city could be viewed as having been successful. And so it's very important to us that we find ways to attract not just jobs, but Black business and Black property ownership into our community, and especially into the Greenwood district.
John, despite all of the efforts we've seen from corporate America in the last 12 months to really address more funds towards Black communities and underserved communities, the reality now is that the Black unemployment rate has risen while the overall employment rate has fallen. What do you make of that and the progress we've been making through this pandemic and the risk of falling behind? How do we escape that feedback loop?
Well, part of the reason why things have gotten so much worse and why we suffered so much in the pandemic gets to the point I made earlier about the University of Chicago. They were willing to, for the first time in many anchor institutions, to work with minority-owned companies in professional services, financial services, and technology, not depend on that old-fashioned term supplier diversity and the fixation that we've had in our society of well-meaning people to hire minority construction firms and catering firms and commodity-oriented firms when they're trying to do business with Black businesses. Well, of course, when the pandemic hit, construction halted. People were, events stopped happening, so catering wasn't so important. Buildings closed, so janitorial services were not so important. But white Americans who were someone's accountant or lawyer or money manager or technology guru, those economies could do really well. Those businesses could thrive during this pandemic. So the wealth divide has just exploded in the wrong direction, partially because we have fallen into this trap of thinking about minority companies doing business in these sort of supply chain areas. At the University of Chicago, what we call it is business diversity, to show all the buyers that we want to be included in the parts of the economy where the wealth and jobs are created today. And we have the flexibility to work from home if necessary, if you have a tragedy like we had with this pandemic. So I think that is really at the heart of why things have gotten so much worse lately. And we have to change that and move this term business diversity, which we are doing here actually throughout Chicagoland. Our business community is starting to embrace that term and realize that supplier diversity is literally 40 years out of date.
Another question I have too is, there's a sign of remigration. And I know, John, you've spoken about this before. What signs do you see of more Black Americans moving back to areas that they have left in the past, especially in the South? Mayor Bynum, I'm also curious as to what you're seeing about people coming back to the area.
I guess I'll just say quickly that it is nice to see that Americans feel comfortable in living in more and more different parts of the country. I have to say one ironic thing that I just can't help but mention is that growing up, I actually grew up on Greenwood Avenue here in Chicago. That was where my mom's home was, 4959 South Greenwood. And the fascinating thing that I've mentioned to George Kaiser and others in Tulsa, years later, President Obama and Michelle Obama bought their home at 51st in Greenwood. So the fact that they live on this historic street in Chicago sort of makes us feel, this connection to Tulsa is really visceral and important here in our hometown.
And I will say here in our community, one of the things that's been really inspiring to see in the last several years is, I've referenced it a few times, but I think it's important for people to understand that this event occurred in 1921, and then in the days after it, our city government, the local chamber of commerce, businesses, they all immediately recognized what a disgrace it was for our city. And so they agreed as community leaders, we're not going to talk about this at all. We're not going to teach it in schools. It's not going to be printed in the newspaper. Any newspapers that did report about it were taken out of the library. And you had generations grow up in this community who didn't hear about this event at all. And so by the time people started talking about it in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there really wasn't a tremendous amount of scholarship out there around it. And in the interim period of time, it's also very important to note, after the race massacre occurred, Greenwood was rebuilt. There were a lot of business owners that came back and invested in the community, rebuild it, only to have urban renewal really deal a crushing blow with a highway constructed right through the middle of the district. And so now, today, in the last 10, 15 years, we've hit a point where people have become more aware. There have been more books written about Greenwood and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre in the last 5 years than there were in the previous 95. There's greater awareness around it today. And because of that, you do have Black entrepreneurs and especially young professionals who are attracted to the community and who are opening businesses in the Greenwood district out of pride for what Black Wall Street was and a desire to rebuild it right now organically. And that is very exciting to see. And of course, we at the city want to do all we can to help foster that more.
So we have a question from the audience with a few minutes left, and it's, what evidence or signs of hope do you see to move the discourse away from polarized views and towards universalization? Do you see the conversation changing? John, maybe you can start us off there.
Yes, the conversation is changing and pretty dramatically. After George Floyd's murder, the number of calls that I've gotten from CEOs from various businesses to come and speak about diversity and inclusion, there seems to be just this true commitment to thinking, like, what can we do better? On the boards that I'm on at McDonald's, Nike, New York Times, I'm having much more fulsome conversations with our management teams around what can we do, how can we ratchet up and get more done and really move the needle for Black community. Where are the holes? What needs to begin? What needs to be done better? So I'm hopeful there. And then finally, we have a progressive congressional leadership, and that is helping. And a progressive president. People often look to Washington D.C. and get guidance and direction. And I think that's also helping to create some real tailwinds that are really creating more equal opportunity for minority entrepreneurs to do well and to maybe finally have access to being a customer. And I think that'll be very, very important.
Mayor Bynum.
I would just say, from a local standpoint, we're a community where the worst event in the history of our city happened, and then people didn't talk about it for about 80 years. I ran for mayor in 2016 because of the racial disparity that exists between the area where Greenwood is located and the rest of our city. A kid that grows up in that area is expected to live 11 years less than a kid that grows up elsewhere in the city. And I ran for mayor saying that I wanted to bring all the tools that the city government has to bear to address that. And the thing that was, campaigns can be very dehumanizing. But the thing that was redeeming about that was it didn't matter what part of town I talked about that disparity in. People were horrified by it and wanted to know what they could do to help. And now we're working on a murder investigation that is 100 years too late, and it is not easy. The technical side of it is the easy part. The human side of it is that you're dealing with issues of profound distrust towards the city because the city waited 98 years to start this. You're dealing with tremendous emotion that has been bottled up in a community that didn't talk about this for 80 years and has now spent 20 years trying to come to terms with something that we spent 80 years not talking about. And the optimism that I have is if we can work through all of that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, with all of the baggage that we have in our background around this, and be successful in working through this together and find a way to build those bridges to work together, I think we can show, not just ourselves, but the country, that there's a way to work together to solve so many more problems that we deal with that are deeply rooted in our country.
I couldn't thank both of you enough for joining us, and honestly, it's my personal mission to be following up with both of you on these topics. Thank you again, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you so much.